Let's not waste so much time because we want to get discussing serious things. So first of all, it is, of course, my great pleasure to introduce Ian Buchanan again. I seem to be doing that quite often recently. Ian is a professor at the University of Wollongong in Australia. And of course, as we heard yesterday, Ian is really the kind of the person who inspired Deleuze studies, really got it to take off at least in the English speaking world. Everybody knows what he has done. So, but perhaps some things that we might not know yet is he has another book coming out following his recently published book on assemblage theory. His book is going to be on schizoanalysis, which is, I believe the subtitle is Unfinished Project, which sounds extremely exciting, and that's already appeared on Amazon. I just checked earlier, so I'm sure everybody can put in a pre-order for that. Of course, Ian's wrote numerous books, not only on Deleuze and on Anti-Oedipus, but also on critical theory and Jameson and Michel de Saussure. And he has, of course, he's been leading the book series for Edinburgh University Press as well on Deleuze. So less of me, want to hear Ian speak about affective assemblages. So over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Joff. And yes, I will confess, I do have to leave. It's actually my son's 18th birthday. So I'm in the middle of cooking for 30 odd people who are coming around for our party tonight, plus setting up party lights and so forth. So it is actually fortunate that we're doing this conference on Zoom, because if it had been in person, I wouldn't have been able to attend because I would have had to be here for my son's birthday. So I'm grateful for that. Thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you everybody for getting up early, depending on where you are in the world, to listen to me bang on. So this paper that I'm presenting is part of a larger project which possibly will never be finished. I'm a big believer in incomplete projects. And it's a project that I'm calling, borrowing from Perry Anderson's title, Arguments with Deleuzians. And it's a kind of a book about responding to what I see as being fairly petty kind of critiques of Deleuze, as a way of kind of clarifying misunderstandings. Plus also it's fun sometimes to just write in a way that's kind of straightforwardly writing back, as opposed to having to be nice. So this paper is, it's one of those papers where I let myself be not nice for a little bit. So the other title for this paper could have been something like Haraway Against Deleuze, or maybe even Must We Like Pets? So did Deleuze and of course Guattari hate pets? And if they did, were they wrong to do so? Now, these are not generally the sort of questions that concern Deleuze and Guattari scholars, but I think that they are illuminating all the same, because to answer them properly, we have to reckon with the difference between what Deleuze and Guattari said about actual animals, which itself needs to be broken down into their opinions about animals, as opposed to their theoretical speculations, and what they meant by becoming animal, which does not necessarily have anything to do with animals. Now, as will become clear, Haraway really only cared about what Deleuze said about actual animals. And as a consequence, she completely fails to understand what they meant by becoming animal, which, as I mentioned, has very little to do with actual animals. As far as Haraway is concerned, this just means that Deleuze and Guattari do not take earthly animals seriously enough. Now, one can imagine Deleuze and Guattari replying that she does not take unearthly animals seriously enough, and they would not be wrong. Her interest in the natural world does not extend to the supernatural world. She quite pointedly refuses the connection to Lovecraft implicit in her concept of the Thuluthene, and instead connects it to a spider that was nevertheless, as she in fact notes, named in honor of Lovecraft's creation. By contrast, Deleuze and Guattari are clearly fascinated by the ontological implications of Lovecraft's work, which they cite several times in the development of the concept of becoming animal. It would be an understatement then to say that Haraway and Deleuze and Guattari are at cross purposes, but Haraway's argument with Deleuze and Guattari still matters, I think, for two reasons. Firstly, because it highlights a common misapprehension of their work, namely a tendency to treat their concepts literally, or just as problematically scientifically, rather than philosophically. And second, because many people, including many Deleuze-Guattari scholars, seem to think her criticisms are cogent. And in the written version of this, I have a long footnote, which I won't read out to you, basically just acknowledging the various responses to Haraway that have so far been produced, many of which are quite clear in saying that Haraway's way of proceeding shows considerable bad faith. But the problem that I have with these various replies is that they do not take the fight to Haraway herself. So in what follows, I want to try to correct that imbalance. So doubtless Haraway is not unaware of the pitfalls of not reading Deleuze and Guattari philosophically, but she flatly refuses to do so because, in her own words, no reading strategies can mute the scorn for the homely and the ordinary in their work. Now, there is no evidence to support Haraway's claim that Deleuze and Guattari are scornful of the homely and the ordinary, as I will make clear, but it is worth pausing for a moment on the surprisingly normative subtext of her complaint, because in many ways, the most powerful feature of Deleuze and Guattari's work is their willing and sympathetic embrace of everything that is unhomely and extraordinary. So Haraway mistakes their embrace of the otherworldly worlds of schizophrenics for scorn for the homely and the ordinary, when in fact it is a profound attempt to try to find a language to better describe and therefore better understand the experience of schizophrenia in its ordinary aspect as that which schizophrenics must live with in their everyday lives. So her constant demand that everything needs to be connected to earthly reality of mud and bodies and so on, doubtless unintentionally, I must add, as a disparagement of the unearthly worlds of schizophrenics sometimes inhabit. Haraway's response to Deleuze and Guattari's work is clearly premised on the view that we must like pets, and that liking pets is an ordinary and, more importantly, a virtuous thing to do. Ironically, for one so quick to criticize Deleuze and Guattari for their apparent antipathy towards pets, there is very little in the way of self-reflection in Haraway's work about the ethics or indeed the practice of owning pets, despite the fact that there are many aspects of pet ownership that are ethically questionable, to say the least. There are moments of self-reflection, such as when she informs us that the book When Species Meet is the mutated spawn, she says, of her encounter with Foucault, and the book she thought she ought to write, which she said might have been called The Birth of the Kennel, which would expose the fact that dogs, and this is a quote, live in domains of techno-biopower. But such moments are few and far between, and they do not really influence her argument. But in not writing The Birth of the Kennel, she thought she was escaping species chauvinism. But in reality, all she did was substitute her own form of it for Foucault's. And this is evident in her angry reaction to Deleuze and Guattari's apparently negative statements about pets, which seems to blind her to what it is that they are actually saying with their concept of becoming animal. Nowhere does she ask whether the concept of becoming animal might have value in its own terms. She simply declares that it does not. Indeed, she goes further than that. She says that she had hoped to find an ally in Deleuze and Guattari, but instead found an enemy. She expected to find support for her companion species project in their work because, as she puts it, their thinking works so hard to get beyond the great divide between humans and critters to find the rich multiplicities and topologies of a heterogeneously and non-teleologically connected world. But instead she found, and again I'm quoting, scorn for all that is mundane and ordinary, and the profound absence of curiosity about or respect for with actual animals. And she even castigates another scholar for failing to observe, in her words, the systematic nausea Deleuze and Guattari let loose against all that is ordinary. Now, although she readily acknowledges that Deleuze and Guattari never intended to write a biological treatise about actual animals, and I must point out that this is one of my kind of pet hates, is the amount of time people seem to want to read Deleuze and Guattari as though they were writing a scientific treatise, she cannot get past their apparent contempt for earthly animals. She expects them to like animals just as she does, without reserve or exception, and to concern themselves with the strictly material and manifestly mundane, without flights into fantasy or into the abstract and sublime, which are her words, realms of the immaterial, even though it is obvious, and I would say to her as much as anyone else, that their project is not about mud, as she wants it to be, but rather about the social, cultural, and indeed cognitive processes that make mud matter in the way it does to Haraway. Now, it is probably just as well that Haraway did not view the first segment of the Abécédaire, the television interview that Deleuze recorded with Cleparnet in 1990. The first segment is entitled A for Animal, because if she had watched it, it would have confirmed all her sorriest suspicions about Deleuze's aversion to animals. And here he talks about actual animals, which is not something he does when he and Guattari develop the concept of becoming animal. Deleuze freely admits that he does not like cats. He says that he cannot stand the way that they rub against him. He concedes, though, that he admires the way they seem to know how to die. And bear in mind, he was himself dying at this point. He also admits that he cannot stand the way dogs bark. It is, he says, the stupidest of cries. They are the shame of the animal kingdom, he says. But having said that, he quite likes the way dogs howl at the moon. But what he really cannot stand is people who try to have a human relationship with their pets rather than an animal relationship, which by contrast, he thinks can be beautiful. So even worse in Deleuze's view is the tendency in psychoanalysis to treat all animals appearing in dreams as stand-ins for humans, usually other family members. And he says, this is execrable, I cannot stand this. Ultimately, Deleuze is ambivalent about animals. He hates certain traits of domestic animals, and he especially hates it when they are treated as familial in the Oedipal sense. But he is also, hang on a sec, sorry. But he's also fascinated by a whole range of animals, including creatures most people find distasteful, such as ticks and lice. And what fascinates him is the way all animals have their own worlds. The influence of Uxku is evident here, though not necessarily decisive. And elsewhere in the interviews, he does talk, when he talks about Melville, for example, he talks about the way they became interested in the concept of territory precisely because they couldn't find an adequate French word to translate the idea of being an outlander, which Melville talks about. And they were quite interested in what it would mean to be an outlander. And in a sense, the concept of territory is a way of trying to explain that idea, that when you are in your territory, you are effectively an inlander. And when you are out of your territory, you become an outlander. These worlds contain territories, a notion that he and Guattari worked on together, and they developed this idea into the notion of territorialization. But his fascination for animals should not be misconstrued for a critical interest in actual human-animal relations, which is really what Haraway is interested in. Because, as I would want to show, becoming animal is in fact a hermeneutic category, not an ethological or ethical category. Now, does this ambivalence about family pets make Deleuze a bad person? Now, Haraway seems to think that it does, and she is evidently quite incensed by Deleuze and Guattari's remarks about pets in A Thousand Plateaus, most notably their quotation, "Anyone who likes pets is a fool." In response to their statements about pets, she declares rather petulantly that she had a newly discovered loyalty to Freud, if only because he kept dogs. But the remark that really sets her off, though, and she does seem to take it personally, is Deleuze and Guattari's observation that Ahab's Moby Dick is not like the little cat or dog owned by an elderly woman who honors and cherishes it. Haraway responds to this by saying, I am not sure I can find in philosophy a clearer display of misogyny, fear of aging, incuriosity about animals, and horror of the ordinariness of the flesh. To which she adds, now in full high dudgeon mode, that it took some nerve for Deleuze and Guattari to write about becoming woman just a few pages later. And I always have this image of Haraway kind of hurling the book across the room at this point. In the next breath, however, she says, from her vantage point of playing in the mud, I can even appreciate a great deal of 1,000 Plateaus. And Haraway also expresses distaste for the familial human way of relating to animals, as in her words, cuddly, furry, cute little childlike dependence. And for this reason, she resists the common parlance of being called the mum of her dogs. My multi-species family, she writes, is not about surrogacy or substitutes, all of which would seem to put her much closer to Deleuze and Guattari's position than she seems ready to admit. Now, although Haraway appears to be personally affronted by Deleuze and Guattari's remark about elderly women, it is clear that she would not see herself as belonging to the Oedipalizing category of pet owner that they are rejecting. So one might ask, why is she so incensed about their remarks? Why are Deleuze and Guattari wrong in saying Ahab's Moby Dick is not like the little cat or dog owned by an elderly woman who honors and cherishes it? Or more to the point, why are they in the wrong for saying this? Why is this statement regarded as inherently disparaging towards women, the elderly, the ordinariness of the flesh, and those people who are curious about animals? On the face of it, it is simply a statement about the fact that Ahab's whale, which, remember, he is willing to pursue to the ends of the earth with the hope of killing it, is quite clearly not the same kind of creature as the little cat or dog owned by an elderly woman or man or anyone else for that matter. What grounds do we have for assuming it is intended to say anything more than that? Haraway seems to think that Deleuze and Guattari are talking about actual elderly women and their dogs, but given that they are comparing them to a fictional character and a fictional whale, there is no reason to assume this must be the case. It is more likely that Deleuze and Guattari are referring to an equally fictional set of elderly women and their dogs, most likely of the variety one finds in late Victorian and early modernist literature, so Henry James, D.H. Lawrence, Marcel Proust, and so on. Now, this may not change much as far as Haraway is concerned, because it could still be read as disparagement. But if it is disparagement, the target is the writers who Oedipalize animals, not elderly women and their pets. But even if it is the case that they are talking about actual elderly women and their pets, in what way is it disparaging to say that they are cherished by their owners? Now, Haraway is also opposed to Deleuze and Guattari's positioning of Moby Dick as exceptional, and she says that it amounts to a bad trip. But it seems clear, though, that that was Melville's intent. In choosing Moby Dick, Ahab breaks with the, I'm quoting Deleuze here, with the law of the whalers, according to which one should first pursue the pack, and so on. So what I've been trying to say then is becoming animal does not conceptualize companionable human-animal relations like the one that exists between Haraway and her dog Cayenne. Rather, it is about strange attractions and dark nuptials, which are their phrases. It is a form of becoming other, not necessarily a kind of becoming with in the companionable way that Haraway intends. Indeed, it is not even necessary that the animal actually exists. Imaginary, dreamt up, fantasized and fantastic animals, including monsters and werewolves and vampires, are just as important to Deleuze and Guattari as the animals that Haraway favors. It can manifest as neurosis or psychosis and so on. So in other words, becoming animal is a way of thinking about pathology, not a way of thinking about ethology. As such, it is strictly incomparable to the kind of human-animal relations Haraway wants to talk about. And that she fails to see this is kind of unfortunate, because it means that she turns into an enemy, a body of writing that could easily have been, I think, an ally. But also there is a kind of fantasy in Haraway's work which suggests that we can, in fact, understand animals. We may feel that we understand them and that they understand us, but the reality is we mostly speak to our pets in the imperative: come here, sit, fetch, go there, and so on. And our conversations are entirely one-sided. Even if the relationship between Haraway and her dog is a happy one, and I have no doubt that it is still premised on a set of circumstances that, if they were applied to human relationships, even between, say, a parent and a child, they would constitute a form of structural violence. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting Haraway is or would ever be violent towards her dog, but let us consider what it means to be a dog living under the care of a human. And I would also add, I have 2 dogs of my own, so I don't exclude myself from this critique. Humans decide for their dogs where they will live, even if that means taking them away from their birth parents and their litter mates. They also decide who they will live with, other humans, other dogs, but also other animals, some of which they might want to eat, but they're not allowed to, such as the pet cat or the pet rabbit. And to a very great extent, they determine how they will live. Humans decide their diet, when and how much they can eat. Vegans even make their dogs vegans too, something I assume dogs would not choose to do if left to their own devices. Humans decide where and when their dogs can go to the toilet, where they'll nap and sleep, and even where and when they can express their territorial instincts by barking and snarling at others. Humans decide when, indeed if at all, their dogs may have intimate relations with other dogs, including the decision to take away the possibility of procreation. Humans determine the amount and type and frequency of physical exercise dogs are allowed to have. Thus, some dogs are more sedentary than they might want to be, while others are perhaps busier than they might want to be. I mean, do dogs really want to do agility courses? Humans make life and death decisions for their dogs to do with healthcare, medication, and end of life. Humans even sell their dogs. Now, these issues are not altogether absent from Haraway's considerations of what her concept of companion species might entail, but neither are they given serious consideration. However, the possibility that any of this might constitute a form of structural violence is studiously ignored. Nowhere does she tackle the question of whether or not it is ethical to remove dogs from their families or, say, to desex them. Not only is she silent on this issue, she also says that anyone who questions her concern for the suffering of individual animals must be some kind of fanatical acolyte of what she calls the one true faith. I don't really know what she means by this. So in many ways, her talk about multi-species relating and existing is a smokescreen for the sometimes brutal practicalities of owning and having pets. If it is not ethically acceptable to forcibly desex one's human children, why is it ethically acceptable to desex one's dog? What ethical paradigm allows for this? And the only answer to this question is human exceptionalism, which Haraway claims to set aside. She acknowledges the fact that humans make decisions concerning healthcare and notes that there is a wide disparity in what people spend on dogs, both within a first world context and globally, but does not question the right of humans to make such decisions, nor consider the implications it might have for the agency of companion species. Now, Haraway tries to short-circuit this debate by arguing, plausibly enough, that dogs and humans evolved together, and that humans didn't so much domesticate dogs as co-evolve with them. Now, this may well be true at a species level, but it does not alter the fact that on a day-to-day level, humans control the lives of dogs in almost every aspect. Moreover, evolving together does not grant humans the right of sovereignty over dogs, and given that dogs are not given the right to decide where they live, who they live with, and how they live, to what extent can one even begin to say that the relationship between human and dog is ethical? Just because a dog responds to the command come and wants to sleep on our bed or have their back rubbed does not mean they have consented to having their lives controlled in every aspect by humans. In other words, it is a nonsense, or at best an unconscious wish fulfillment, for Haraway to say that human exceptionalism is refused when humans hold all the cards. Now, I realize that I'm probably running short of time. How am I going, Joss? Give me a hand signal.
A little bit. 5 minutes, is that
5
reasonable?
minutes? Sure, that's fine. So I'll kind of skip to the good bits, if you like, and stop ranting about Haraway. So one of the ways by which I think we can respond to Haraway is to say, well, we should ask, why did they invent the concept of becoming animal? Like, what did they actually need it for? And this, I think, is the kind of question that Deleuze would ask us to ask of any kind of theory that we come across. So what is the animating problem at the foundation of becoming animal? And the answer is not obvious to us, I think, is the product of a kind of prejudice that we have against the notion of interpretation, which is, of course, a prejudice that we've kind of picked up like a virus from Deleuze and Guattari themselves. It is now more or less accepted as a doctrine that Deleuze and Guattari were opposed to all forms of interpretation, which in turn is taken to mean they could not possibly be interested in something as old-fashioned and apparently boring as hermeneutics. But the simple fact is that they are interested in hermeneutics, and the development of the concept of becoming animal can only be understood from within a hermeneutic framework. Because the problem that becoming animal answers to is precisely the problem of how do we interpret human-animal relations as they are manifested in dreams and delirium. Now, this is a hermeneutic problem, not an ethological problem, because it relates to interpretation, not relation. So their principal exhibit is Freud's case study of the Wolfman, which is used to demonstrate that psychoanalysis lacks the conceptual means of understanding the Wolfman situation. But it is also used to demonstrate that Deleuze and Guattari have the conceptual means of understanding the Wolfman. In other words, it's a way of saying Freudian interpretation wrong, Deleuze and Guattari interpretation right, and we can only understand that if we think of it in hermeneutic terms. So as I have observed elsewhere, it is my view that Jameson is correct in arguing that their anti-interpretive position, and here I'm quoting Jameson, amounts less to a nullification of interpretive activity than the demand for the construction of some new and more adequate immanent or anti-transcendent hermeneutic model. And that, I think, is really what becoming animal talks is really about. So in other words, sorry, I realize I'm just a little bit out of time here. What I wanted to do is just to take you through the Deleuze and Guattari's discussion of the mimetic models, but that'll take a bit of time, so I will trust that you all remember what that was about. So as a hermeneutic model, psychoanalysis has obviously been extremely productive because it can always detect the triangular assemblage of desire entailed by the mummy, daddy, and me model that it invented. And in this sense, it is never at a loss for what to say about any kind of psychic production. It considers, because it always knows ahead of time, it's going to find mummy, daddy, and me. So what happens then if we get rid of mummy, daddy, and me, and we get rid of the idea that the animal doesn't always stand for some kind of a human? And that essentially is the position that we're at once we get to becoming animal. So when differently constituted of assemblages of desire are encountered, such as one finds in dreams and deliriums and so on, psychoanalysis interpretations begin to seem forced or completely off base, as Freud's interpretation of the Wolfman dream appears to be. So Deleuze and Guattari are unforgiving in their criticism of the way psychoanalysis has tried to interpret schizophrenic, but we should not assume this means that they have no interest in trying to interpret it themselves. Failing to try to understand schizophrenics is just as problematic for them as failing to understand, as trying to understand them in a psychoanalytic sense. So the last thing they want is for schizophrenic productions to be treated as either meaningless or what amounts to the same thing as ineffable, because both these conclusions lead to the same result, namely that schizophrenics are not listened to. So the concept of becoming animal should be seen as an attempt to create the means of hearing what schizophrenics are trying to say. And in Deleuze and Guattari's interpretive leap then is to treat the wolf as an affect rather than an avatar. And I'll stop there, but you can see how this project leads into the idea of affective assemblages, because fundamentally one could say that the reason we have assemblages is in fact to manage the affects that we have. Thank you.